Welcome to Decision Point and our first in a three-part series on evolution, creationism, or intelligent design. We have Dr. Ray Boland with us, who has a doctorate in molecular and cellular biology from University of Texas at Dallas and travels around the world talking about this issue from a scientific perspective. Welcome, Dr. Boland.
Thank you, Hollis. Glad to be with you.
Yeah. Well, we're fascinated with this particular topic and the fact that it is something that is actually very controversial. What exactly is intelligent design?
Well, intelligent design is really a two-part movement, if I can say. First of all, it challenges Darwinism and its dependence on purely natural process, mutation, natural selection, to account for all the things we see in living things. So we're trying to challenge that to say that's not sufficient to account for the amazing molecular machines and adaptations we see in living things. And on the second part, it's a research program that wants to investigate the effects of intelligent causes. And by that I mean, as people, our minds are almost naturally geared towards discerning whether something is intelligently designed or not. And what I'm talking
we have
about,
a sense of that something is either naturally made or man-made. Is that what you're saying, kind of?
Yeah, we look at a bridge, we know humans did that. It was engineered.
Right.
When you see a natural bridge, say in one of the western national parks here, well, you can tell, well, that wasn't designed. It was just brought about by natural process.
Right. Now, where does the term intelligent design come from?
Well, it's been in use for quite a number of decades, but in the last 15, 20 years, it's been really kind of taken by this movement that really just wants to realize, okay, there is design, but we can tell whether it's intelligently designed or not. And so it's not trying to in any way manipulate the idea who or what is this intelligence, but that can we tell if it's intelligently designed or not.
Yeah. Now, is there any attempt to make this into a religious point of view or a spiritual point of view at all?
No, not at all, and that's one of the unique things about it. Most forms of creationism almost always start with a particular interpretation of Genesis 1 through 11, and then they look into the scientific evidence to see what they can come up with that corresponds to their biblical interpretation. With intelligent design, we're simply looking at the scientific evidence itself, and your biblical understanding doesn't matter in how you interpret the evidence.
Oh, that's pretty interesting that the biblical perspective doesn't matter, but there can still be the thought that there's something we don't understand behind the design of things.
Right.
Yeah.
The source of design isn't what the scientific evidence can tell us.
Right. Now, because we are coming from a biblical perspective on this program and we're looking at things through that particular lens, what scriptural verses kind of resonate to you that this is in fact something that is compatible with a faith point of view?
Yeah, which really becomes sort of a life verse to me is Romans 1:18-20. And in there, Paul is beginning his theological defense of the gospel in the book of Romans. And he begins by just saying that there's a truth that people know, but they're suppressing that truth in their wickedness. And he says this truth is evident to them. God has made it evident to them. And then in verse 20, he simply says that since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his divine power and eternal nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that men are without excuse. So what he's simply saying is that look out into nature and you will see plain, clear evidence of the existence of God.
And do you think that this is something that is internationally discernible or something that is unique to the biblical Christian perspective?
Well, Paul is making it clear that this applies to all men and women, and this is not limited to your particular worldview or religious perspective, that if you're simply observing and looking for the evidence, that it'll be clear to you. And what I get excited about in this particular time is that the evidence just is mounting daily of evidence of a clear, intelligent design for the existence of God, and I think this is a great time to be a scientist, to be alive, and to begin to see, as we probe deeper into the depths of the cell and the universe and everything about it, that it's clearly been designed for life and for us.
It is rather ironic that the more that science and politically correct entities try to suppress this truth, the more obvious it becomes, the more we delve into things like the Genome Project and things. But one of the examples you use that I like is the Mount Rushmore example. Can you explain that?
Yeah.
We'll put those graphics up.
If you're driving through the Dakotas and you come across Mount Rushmore, when you immediately look at it, there's no question in your mind that that was done by an intelligence. I mean, you look at the color of the rock, it's white compared to the dark gray surrounding it. You see four very recognizable faces of four presidents: Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, Lincoln. You recognize those faces. No matter what angle you look at Mount Rushmore, you will see the same four individuals, same four faces. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You know that's intelligently designed.
Yeah. And then you contrast that with the man in the mountain. Is that it?
Yeah, there's an old man on the mountain that's been known since 1805 in New Hampshire, and it's on the face of a cliff. And if you get at just the right angle, at just the right time of day, so there's light behind it, you can see the silhouette of a man. You see his forehead, you see his nose, you see his lips, you see a very strong chin, and they've just called it the old man on the mountain. But what's different about that is, although you can recognize the profile, if you move 90 degrees around and look at it straight on, you can't tell what's the nose, what's the chin, the design in a sense disappears, the man disappears. And that's what you'll find with natural design. We look at both of those and we can immediately discern that one is intelligently designed, one is not. The one other aspect about the man in the mountain is that he also not only has a birth date of 1805 when he was found, but he has a death date of 2003 because the old man in the mountain's face fell off the mountain.
Oh.
So he's no longer there.
Gee, that's too bad. Yeah. Now, creationism is another area that is very controversial. How is intelligent design different from creationism? Well, first of all, what is creationism? People may not know.
Well, creationism comes in two forms, and you can call it either a young earth creationism or an old earth creationism. In both versions, they are both looking at the Genesis 1 creation account, Genesis 1 through 3 particularly, and they discern from that a particular biblical interpretation, understanding what the text is trying to say. And those who are from a young earth perspective are saying, well, those days are 24-hour literal days, they're consecutive, and so as you count up the generations given in Genesis 5 and 11, you come to an earth that's about 6,000 years old. The old earth creationists would say, you know, I don't think those days really are 24 hours days. Those could be indefinite periods of time. We don't know how long they were. I see a sequence in the events that mirrors what would happen if the Big Bang actually happened 13 billion years ago. But in each case, they're saying God is the creator. And even in old earth creationism, they say God has intervened through time and created new forms, new structures, new designs as life has continued and as the earth has developed. So they're both indicating that God is created, but just over different periods of time. And
has the concept of time and that sort of thing changed from, say thousands or probably millions of years ago in terms of how biology operates and that sort of thing? Do we see any biological evidence of the Earth dramatically changing or the environment dramatically changing?
Well, again,
in Genesis?
It does depend on which view you hold there.
Yeah.
Even with the young earth view, they would say that the earth dramatically changed at the time of the Genesis flood, at the time of Noah. Their contention is that almost all the fossil-bearing layers around the world were laid down as a result of Noah's flood. So they would say the earth was dramatically transformed in a very short period of time. According to the scriptures, Noah was on the ark for 371 days. So you're talking about just a couple of years for all this stuff to happen. Whereas in the case of the old earth creationists, they're definitely saying, yeah, the earth is transformed, and it has changed over millions of years, but it's been a very slow and gradual process.
Now, there are a lot of Christians who have a real aversion to the concept of creationism.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? They do not like it. In fact, when people found out that you were going to do this show, they said, oh no, I hope he's not going to talk about creationism and advocate that,
What many people are quite concerned about, who are Christians, they may have already accepted that evolution is reality. And in their minds, that's what the scientific evidence demonstrates. And what they're concerned about as Christians is that it makes all of Christians look foolish if we're trying to fight against evolution, which they consider to be now scientific fact. And to them, it's an embarrassment that other Christians cannot simply go along with the current scientific program. And in their minds, then, we get relegated as Christians, all of us, including themselves, off to some backwater of uneducated and just unwilling
ignorant,
to, ignorant.
Yeah. Now, what about, are there examples of other theories, which the theory of evolution is a theory, that people held really tightly to for many years and then has recently been scientifically disproven? Can you think of anything?
Well, nothing very recently. In the last few decades, there was an idea that came up in the early 20th century that the continents were drifting. And the continents were moving apart. And standard geology just lambasted it, critiqued it, ridiculed it, actually. And it wasn't until about the 1960s where they began to see the mid-ocean ridges, where they could see that magma was coming up and was pushing out, and therefore in the mid-ocean, so that the continents were being separated out. And they began to see that's the origin of earthquakes, volcanoes, all kinds of things. And that was overturned within just a 10-year period of time when it was ridiculed for decades.
And so it's actually something that was very definitely disproven, that was held to for many, many years.
In science, it's not just the evidence. There's a very real human political element to it. And if you've built your career on a particular idea or theory or way of understanding your field, it's going to take a lot to get you to shift off of that, because it says something negative about all the work that you've done to this point. So there's a very real human element that becomes political, and oftentimes an old theory doesn't really get pushed aside until many of those advocates are either retired or dying off, and the younger generation is now a bit freer to pursue the evidence as they've been seeing it for a long time.
Now, do you see that that's going to be happening with evolution and intelligent design?
With evolution and ID, I think that's about the only way it's going to happen. There are a lot of younger scientists and graduate students who are very receptive. They're not exactly in the camp of intelligent design, but they're seeing our critique. They're understand this is making sense to me. But they also understand that the climate in their particular department and in their particular field is not ready to listen to any of that. And so they pretty much keep their mouth shut and gather what information they can on the sly, on the internet, and follow things as best they can, but don't say much of anything publicly. And so for them, very really, in a very real sense, the old guard needs to move along a little bit and lose some of their influence in order to free them up to pursue these research avenues that they're growing very excited about.
So what would be an example of something that they would pursue if they believed that intelligent design was viable versus evolution? How does that affect research? Well,
something has happened recently that's been very, very exciting and controversial to watch. For many decades, the standard evolutionary line about our human genome was that most of it was junk, was not usable, was not being used for anything. It's what they called selfish DNA that simply made small copies of itself, inserted itself elsewhere, and just didn't do anything for the human organism. And they estimated usually something greater than 90% of the DNA in all of our cells was useless stuff. And that's what they called junk DNA. And just this last September, the ENCODE project, which is a follow-up to the Human Genome Project, which sequenced the entire genome, ENCODE is trying to figure out, okay, what are all these sequences doing? And Encyclopedia of DNA Elements is what it really means, is short for. And they announced just last September with a series of articles that 80% of the human genome has a biochemical function. It's doing something in the cell. And that has really raised a lot of controversy because that goes against the grain of many evolutionists who for decades were saying it's junk, but now we're saying, yeah, it's actually doing something. And for a long time, nobody bothered to even look into this other DNA because they all thought it was junk. So there was not an official ban, but there was just a utilitarian sense that this isn't worth our time. And we wasted decades that we could have been finding out more.
Right. So the concept of the junk DNA was that it wasn't serving a useful purpose, and therefore would eventually
They thought it was an
disappear
evolutionary leftover.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't disappear because they have this concept in their heads of selfish DNA. And there are small segments of DNA throughout all of our cells that are unique sequences and that they have the capability to make a copy of themselves. And then that copy then just reinserts itself someplace else in our genome, in some other chromosome. And that just seemed to be useless, repetitive stuff. And it's located all over our genome, but now we're discovering that even those repetitive sequences have a regulatory function of how certain genes are actually expressed and the timing of how they're expressed, what tissues they're expressed in. And so we're seeing a hierarchical organization of DNA.
So what would be an example of something that was considered junk and is now considered useful that they've discovered?
Well, in mouse cells, for example, mouse early embryos, there's a certain kind of sequence called an ERV, E-R-V, and that stands for endogenous retrovirus. And it just has a sequence that looks like an old virus that's just kind of decayed a little bit. Viruses have the capability to insert their DNA into ours, make copies of themselves, and make more virus. Well, this was just one that instead of making more viruses, it just inserted itself elsewhere in the genome. So there are thousands and thousands of these copies of these ERVs in mouse cells and in our cells. And they made an interesting observation in the very earliest mouse embryo, in the 1-cell, 2-cell, 4-cell stage, that these ERV sequences were highly transcribed in RNA in thousands of copies, tens of thousands of copies. And they thought, man, that's just really strange. What is that all about? So again, this would have thought to have been junk DNA previously. So what they did is they created a way by which they could block the expression of all those ERV sequences so that no copies would be made. So let's see what happens with these mouse embryos. And 60% of them could not develop. Wow. So somehow those viral sequences have some kind of regulatory significant role in early embryological development that no one would have predicted a decade ago.
So
now they're significant. If you don't have it, the mouse doesn't grow.
Right. Yeah. So there's definitely, and that's a result of thinking that challenging the assumption that it was junk basically or not useful. Yeah. And so how are these young scientists who are more open to intelligent design? How are they being influenced since over and over again now evolution is so heavily prevalent in all textbooks, everything from grade school on up. How are they being influenced?
Well, a lot of it is through the publishing of scholars and fellows from the Discovery Institute, which I'm also a fellow of. 2009 brought out a book from Steve Meyer, president of the Center for Science and Culture at Discovery, on signature in the cell. And there he develops the long-term history of origin of life research, and then goes into the current situation and begins to show that it's not just arranging chemicals anymore that is the problem. How do we link amino acids that can make proteins without life existing yet? How do we link nucleotides together to make DNA without life already existing? How do we make these large macromolecules that life depends on in a completely non-life situation? What he's added to that is that what we see within the DNA genetic code is an informational code. So it's not just enough to have the matter and the energy in place. We've got to have the information. Where does the information come from? You had to have that in place for the first cell to survive and thrive and reproduce. And what we know today from all of our experience is that informational codes only come from an intelligence.
Yeah. So the question is where was the first intelligence?
Well,
Yeah.
and if you're going to tell me that this genetic code came about without intelligence, you've got a big task in front of you. Because we have no experience whatsoever in computer languages, in human languages, whatever kind of language you want to talk about, we don't know how that could happen.
And now, Darwinists have standard rebuttals to intelligent design. What are some of the standard things that they say that to refute intelligent design?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of it ends up being a word game. We've discussed the differences between creationism and intelligent design, and often the way intelligent design is described, they don't just use the word intelligent design, or if they do, they put it in little quotation marks to indicate, well, that's what they say it is, but we know different. Or they'll call it intelligent design creationism. And simply tagging that extra word onto the phrase, in their minds, well, they're prejudicing in the mind of the reader what they think that is. And that's what I mean. A lot of it really is word games. And that's been really unfortunate. You see a lot of a play on authority in the sense that, okay, I'm a geneticist at the University of Chicago or MIT or wherever, and I know for certain this is not the case. This is not true. This is just a religious movement, and on it goes. Well, what they're really banking on is the fact, well, you're a pretty important guy. You must be pretty smart, and if you think that's just a bunch of junk, well, then it must be. And science just doesn't work that way. A play to authority is a very political and unscientific way of going about persuasion. And there have been attempts at times to deal with some of the actual evidence we've talked about. There are some, for instance, with the origin of information, they simply rely on what they consider the fact of evolution. Okay, an informational system exists. We know evolution is true. Therefore, somehow, evolution did this. And we'll discover it eventually. They place their faith in the process of science. They say science has solved so many riddles for us over centuries that we don't expect that track record to stop. So, okay, maybe we don't know about this, but we'll figure it out eventually. And that's, again, that's a play on ignorance. It doesn't solve anything.
So do people and scientists who are interested in and do research on the basis of intelligent design use the standard scientific methodology, peer review, and all of that stuff?
Absolutely. The Discovery Institute has helped founded something called the Biologic Institute up in the Seattle area in Washington. And it is a standard research laboratory. They've got a number of research scientists who are working there in the laboratory day after day. And they've had to form their own journal, online journal, Biocomplexity, that has an editorial review board that is international, and it contains individuals who are supportive of intelligent design, individuals who are questionable about it, and individuals who definitely don't adhere to it, but they're willing to be a part of this editorial review board. Okay, you want a shot? We'll help give you a shot, and we will interact with you. And so they've been publishing through that journal and doing a lot of excellent work and excellent standard scientific research. But it's unfortunate that we had to create our own journal to get it published.
Right, yeah. And so politically speaking, it's very difficult for a scientist who's coming from an intelligent design perspective in his or her research to actually get it published in a typical journal.
Well, yes, if you actually use the word intelligent design in a favorable way anywhere in your article, in your paper, they'll just give it back to you.
So that's one way the truth is suppressed, as they say in Romans.
Yes, it is. And if you are going to try to publish something like that, you have to be very careful with your language, and you have to check, double check, triple check all of your work, all of your research, all your results, all your calculations, and absolutely be sure there isn't the slightest small mistake in it that will give anyone the excuse to say, no, you're wrong.
Now, if I'm going to explain intelligent design to a friend or neighbor, how can I do that easily? I can see how you can do it. I'm just wondering how I can do it.
Yeah. Well, I suppose a good way is referring back to the Mount Rushmore and Man in the Mountain, and that what we're looking for in biological creatures are those types of evidences from Mount Rushmore where it's clearly intelligently designed. Natural process can't do that. It's not that it's unlikely, but it can't do that as opposed to very natural design.
So just using an example like that is going to at least get the point across.
Yeah, it helps clarify
right.
the issue, and it doesn't get you into the details of biology, but at least helps discern what the difference is.
Yeah, and so that's definitely an easier thing for me to explain
Yeah.
than something else. Yeah. Now, from a biblical perspective, is there another scriptural verse that really illuminates this issue more so?
Well, for me, just the very first verse of Genesis, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And it clearly says, no matter what time frame you put to all that, God was involved in bringing about the process. God was involved in bringing about the end point where we're at today. And as with any creator, there is an imprint that they put on it, not just what the final product is, like Mount Rushmore, but how they went about achieving it. Paintings of Vincent van Gogh clearly indicate towards the end of his life, just with the colors he used, the types of brush strokes he used, that his mind was getting more and more disturbed.
Right, yeah.
It didn't matter what the finished product was, but his method tells you something. And so as we look into nature, if God indeed is the creator, I'm expecting to find signposts that indicate there was a massive intelligence involved here.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but we're having you back for a couple more sessions,
Great.
So we'll continue the conversation.
Okay, thank you.
After listening to Dr. Boland, what do you believe? I want to hear from you on KSCE 38/Decision Point, on the web, on Facebook or Twitter. Thank you so much for watching.